When you begin to understand the power of a single mindset shift, everything about your inner world starts to change in ways that may feel subtle at first, but become deeply transformative over time. Most people live with a constant background of self-doubt, not because they are incapable or unworthy, but because their thoughts have been shaped by repetition, past experiences, and external opinions they have absorbed without question. This is where the idea often associated with Dr. Joseph Murphy becomes especially meaningful, because it emphasizes that the subconscious mind accepts what it is repeatedly given, whether positive or negative, and then works to reflect that belief back into your life. When you consistently think, "I am not good enough," your mind begins to treat that as a fact, influencing your emotions, your decisions, and even your behavior in situations where confidence is required. However, the moment you introduce a deliberate shift, where you choose to question that inner voice instead of obeying it, you begin to interrupt that cycle. This is not about ignoring reality or pretending challenges do not exist. Instead, it is about changing the internal foundation from which you interpret those challenges. For example, when self-doubt arises before an important decision or opportunity, instead of accepting it as truth, you can reframe it into something more empowering, such as recognizing that uncertainty is a natural part of growth and learning. Over time, this practice trains your mind to respond differently, slowly weakening the emotional intensity of fear-based thoughts. What makes this shift so powerful is that it does not require external validation or sudden life changes. It begins entirely within your own awareness. As you continue applying this principle, you may notice that situations which once felt intimidating begin to feel more manageable, not because they have changed, but because your perception of yourself has changed. This is where consistent mental repetition becomes essential, as emphasized in the teachings inspired by Dr. Joseph Murphy, because the subconscious mind responds most strongly to patterns rather than isolated thoughts. By repeatedly affirming new beliefs about your capabilities, you begin to replace doubt with expectation and hesitation with quiet confidence. This process is not instant, but it is steady and cumulative, meaning that every time you consciously choose a stronger thought over a weaker one, you are reshaping your internal identity. Eventually, this new mindset becomes more natural than the old one, and self-doubt loses its control over your actions. You begin to approach life with a sense of possibility rather than limitation, and decisions that once felt overwhelming start to feel like opportunities for growth. Building on this mindset shift, it becomes important to understand how deeply ingrained self-doubt actually operates within the human mind, and why it often feels so automatic and difficult to control. The thoughts you experience on a daily basis are not random. They're the result of repeated mental patterns that have been reinforced over time through experience, environment, and emotional association. When a person consistently reacts to challenges with fear or hesitation, the subconscious begins to store that reaction as a default response. This is why change requires more than just motivation. It requires consistent mental reconditioning. In the teachings often associated with Dr. Joseph Murphy, the subconscious mind is described as a powerful force that does not argue or analyze, but simply accepts what is impressed upon it through repetition and emotional intensity. This means that if a person repeatedly identifies themselves as doubtful, incapable, or unworthy, the subconscious will treat those statements as instructions and begin shaping behavior accordingly. However, when that same principle is applied in a deliberate and constructive way, it becomes possible to reverse the pattern entirely. Instead of reinforcing limitation, a person can begin reinforcing possibility, confidence, and inner stability. This does not mean that doubt disappears instantly, but rather that its influence begins to weaken as new thought patterns grow stronger. For instance, when facing a situation that triggers insecurity, such as speaking in front of others or making an important decision, the mind may initially default to fear-based thinking. Yet with practice, an individual can learn to pause and consciously introduce a different interpretation, such as viewing the situation as an opportunity to learn rather than a threat to self-worth. Over time, this reframing becomes more natural, and the emotional charge behind self-doubt begins to decrease. What makes this process especially powerful is that it does not rely on external circumstances changing first. Instead, it focuses on changing the internal response, which then influences how external circumstances are experienced. As this inner transformation continues, individuals often notice that they begin to act differently without forcing themselves because their sense of identity is gradually shifting. They start making choices with more clarity, speaking with more assurance, and recovering more quickly from setbacks. Even mistakes begin to feel less like evidence of failure and more like part of a learning process. This is the true essence of the mindset shift being discussed. It is not about becoming someone else, but about removing the mental barriers that have been limiting who you already are. And as this new pattern strengthens through repetition and awareness, self-doubt loses its authority, replaced by a steady sense of inner trust that guides decisions with greater calm and confidence. As this transformation deepens, it becomes clear that overcoming self-doubt is not a single moment of change, but an ongoing process of mental discipline and awareness that shapes the way a person experiences every part of life. One of the most important realizations is that thoughts are not just passing events in the mind. They're active forces that influence emotional states, physical behavior, and long-term identity formation. When someone consistently identifies with doubt, hesitation becomes their default setting, and opportunities that require confidence are often avoided or delayed. However, when a mindset shift is fully embraced, a new internal structure begins to form, where thoughts of capability gradually replace thoughts of limitation. This does not happen through force or denial, but through consistent redirection of attention and meaning. In the approach inspired by Dr. Joseph Murphy, the subconscious mind plays a central role in this transformation because it responds most strongly to repeated impressions combined with emotional belief. When a person begins to intentionally feed their subconscious with ideas of confidence, strength, and inner stability, those ideas slowly become the foundation of how they see themselves. At first, the old patterns of self-doubt may still appear, especially in moments of pressure or uncertainty, but their influence begins to weaken as new mental habits take hold. For example, instead of immediately assuming failure in a challenging situation, the mind starts to consider alternative outcomes, including success and growth. This shift in interpretation is subtle, but it is extremely powerful because it changes the emotional response attached to the experience. Over time, this new response becomes automatic, and the individual no longer needs to consciously fight against doubt as often as before. Another key aspect of this process is self-observation, where a person learns to notice their thoughts without immediately accepting them as truth. This creates a space between thought and reaction, allowing conscious choice to replace unconscious habit. In that space, the mindset shift becomes active because the individual can decide whether to reinforce doubt or redirect toward confidence. As this practice continues, it begins to influence not only internal dialogue, but also outward behavior, such as communication style, decision-making speed, and willingness to take on new challenges. Life begins to feel less like something happening to the individual and more like something they're actively participating in shaping. Even setbacks start to carry a different meaning, becoming feedback rather than final judgment. This gradual evolution of thought and perception is what ultimately dissolves the grip of self-doubt. It is not removed by force, but replaced through repetition, awareness, and a steady commitment to thinking in alignment with a stronger internal identity that supports growth, courage, and self-trust in every situation.